for attending this webinar on solar energy leasing. I'm Paul Geringer. I'm an Extension Legal Specialist here at the University of Maryland, and I am going to introduce Shannon Ferrell from Oklahoma State University, where he is an Associate Professor in Agricultural Law in the Department of Ag Economics. And I believe Shannon just won an award, not for this program, but for his wind leasing program. So hopefully this one will become an award-winning program.
It's my hope that someday we can raise this to the level of award-winning solar leasing program.
I will point out our sponsors below are Ashley Ellickson, who's also on this, and I work with the Department of Ag and Resource Economics here at the University of Maryland. We're a part of the Ag Law Education Initiative here. And we had Texas A&M's AgriLife Extension, and then Shannon through the Department of Agricultural Economics at OSU also sponsored this. So I will hand it over to Shannon and not eat up any more of his time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys very much for being a part of this. And like we said, this is actually the first time we're presenting this particular program, so it may not be award-winning yet, but we're going to do our best. Solar energy leasing is pretty new as a concept for lots of our ag landowners in the United States. We've seen, the explosive growth of wind over the past 20 years in the United States. So we're starting to get a little bit more experience in terms of negotiating wind energy leases, kind of trying to figure out what the market is for wind energy leasing. But we've got a lot of ground to cover with solar, but this will kind of give you a basic outline of the basics of the solar industry, things to look at when you're presented with a solar lease, and hopefully get you on the right path towards getting someone to actually take a good, critical look at a lease and figure out if it's the right decision for their farm. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is, first off, the basics of the solar power industry, and we're going to be very basic, but the reason that we kind of talk about these fundamentals is not to, as my dad says, when someone asks you what time it is, they tell you how to make a watch. We're not trying to do that, but as you go through your solar energy lease, you kind of need to understand how the industry works so that you can understand what the developer wants and then figure out how to balance that with your own interests in the lease agreement as well. So we're going to talk about the basics of how solar power works. Then we're going to talk about 5 questions every landowner needs to ask about their lease. And these are 5 questions. Each question, like a good law exam, has 27 subparts. But generally, there are 5 things we want you to take a look at. Number 1, if I sign up my land for solar development, how is that going to impact my ability to use the land? And the short version of the story is that solar projects tend to take up relatively small amounts of land, but they use the land very intensively. Now, contrast that to wind projects, which might have footprints over miles, but they actually use a tiny fraction of that land. So the odds are, if we're talking about a solar use, we're talking about a very intensive use of a small piece of property. How long does the agreement last? And when we first saw wind energy leases come onto the scene, we saw lease agreements that purported to be, a century long. That quickly got corrected by the marketplace, but they're still fairly long, 20 to 30 years in many cases. And what we've seen so far with the solar industry is that's also the case too, and there's reasons for that we'll talk about. What are your obligations as a landowner? For example, if you're in an oil and gas lease, your obligation may simply be get out of the way and let the company pump oil and gas. But when you're engaged in a solar lease, you might actually have some more affirmative obligations that you have to take care of as a landowner. Then, of course, how do you get paid? Now, note, I could have put that first on the list, but as soon as I talk about the payment stuff, everyone tunes out the rest of it. And I don't want you to do that, because the other elements of the lease can be just as important, if not more so, because they impact your rights, I think, far more than the actual compensation does. But we'll talk about that. And then what happens when the project is over? Am I going to just have old solar panels in my place, or is there going to be some sort of obligation to actually clean those things up? And last but not least, we'll talk about some of the issues surrounding solar development. There are kind of a lot of misperceptions, lots of issues about aesthetic issues with solar, and we'll talk about all those as well. So, like we said, let's kick things off with talking a little bit about the fundamentals of how the solar energy industry works. Now, if you look at a map of all the solar projects, you're going to see something that's not terribly surprising. You're going to see the bulk of those projects occurring in the Southwest, where it's pretty sunny all the time. And so that tends to be obviously where solar projects are, right? But what may be more surprising is that you see a lot of projects along the eastern seaboard, especially when it comes to photovoltaic. If you look at the legend on the map there, you'll see those are the red dots. Those are PV projects. Lots of those kicking off along the eastern seaboard, some of those in the Tennessee Valley Authority, even a few of those around the Great Lakes. So solar power is where you expect it to be, but it may also be in some places that you don't expect it to be. And that's a little bit because there's not just one scale of solar project. Tonight, we're going to be talking primarily about utility scale projects, and there's really not a good definition of what's utility scale, but we're talking about rather large scale projects where the primary power purchaser is going to be an electrical utility. There are lots of projects, though, that are just basically rooftop projects. They may be what we call distributed generation, or DG. And when we talk about DG projects, we're just talking about solar or wind or other renewable projects that use several small generators to feed power to the electrical grid versus using one large field or one large generator to feed that power in. Where would I look for a solar project? Well, I'd probably look where it's sunny, and not surprisingly, you see that a lot of that does occur in the Southwest. And there's a couple of things that we need to point out. This map is of direct normal irradiance, or DNI, if you see that referred to in any of the solar literature. And when we talk about direct normal irradiance, we're talking about what would be the average annual power density, in other words, kilowatt hours per square meter per day, if we keep our solar collector pointed at a perfect angle to the sun, meaning that the collector is always at 90 degrees relative to the incoming sunlight. So the only way for us to do that is if we have a motorized mount or some other system that keeps that solar panel constantly perpendicular to the incidence angle of the sun. That's how we get the maximum amount of solar energy, by constantly keeping the collector perfectly squared to the sun. But there's another measure that we can use too, and that's global horizontal irradiance, or GHI, and that just says if we have a collector located horizontally to the ground, we don't ever move it, we just leave it horizontal to the ground surface, that's the amount of radiation that we get, again, in kilowatt hours per square meter per day if we just had that flat, non-moving collector there. And again, you see that it's largely the same, but it's a little bit more smoothed out across the United States as well. A little bit more down into the Gulf Coast region, a little bit more into the Great Plains, and a little bit further north as we get into the Southwest as well. Now, since this is a seminar targeted at Maryland, although I know there are some of you folks from other parts of the country as well, I figured I need to at least put in a map here of Maryland. And Maryland, if you're looking at DNI, has some fairly reasonable resources. And if you look at GHI, it's actually even more robust. So there are some opportunities for solar power development in Maryland specifically. Now, if I'm a developer and I have the entire United States at my disposal, and I'm trying to figure out where should I put my solar power project, what do I look for? And by the way, I'm just talking about this in a general siting sense. There's one other thing I probably should talk about before I list these factors, and that is the market, which kind of matters, right? Lots of people say there's lots of renewable energy projects in California, for example, because, well, California has its own emission standards, it has its own climate targets, and they have a policy environment that's very supportive of renewables, so that's why all those projects are there. And all of those things are true. But there's one thing people often forget to talk about when they mention why there are so many renewable projects in California, and that's because their power prices are very high. Their power prices, generally, the last time I looked at their market data, we're about 21 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's just a better market for power in California. So obviously, in addition to the resource, you care about where the market is, obviously, because better prices for power just simply mean more profitable projects. So if I'm looking for a solar project site, the first thing I'm going to look for is, surprise, surprise, the sun. Again, not shocking at all. If you were building a wind energy project, you'd probably look at a resource map that showed where things are windiest. Hello, Oklahoma, right? So if you're looking for a solar project, you're looking for sun, which is why you, again, saw so many projects there in the desert Southwest. But there are other factors that you have to think about. When we're talking about solar power, I mean, this may sound like a dumb statement, but you can't overlook it. Solar panels only generate power when there is light. Now, there's light pretty much from dawn till dusk. Again, Ferrell, that's a pretty no-duh statement. But there are varying levels of sunlight. For example, when you have a cloud go past the sun, that doesn't mean that it's completely dark. So you're still getting some sort of solar generation capacity there, but you may have a sharp drop off in that. So it's not just hours of sunlight in a given area, but it's also how many hours of the year do we have unobstructed sunlight. So if we have a very cloudy climate, that means we have obstructed sunlight, a significant part of the time, versus a place that maybe doesn't have as much direct sunlight, but that has fewer clouds. That might actually be a trade-off the developer is willing to make. Cloud cover is an important factor. Terrestrial shadow creators. That's a fancy word for things on the ground that cause shadows. So that might be tall trees, that might be nearby hills, that might be tall buildings, but anything that's anchored to the ground that creates shadows are a concern for us as well. Another thing the developer is going to look for is unobstructed land. In other words, things that have few impediments to the construction of the project. Broad, open, flat areas tend to work better. Believe it or not, solar projects are somewhat susceptible to slope because that simply affects the geometry of how the panels can be placed. Proximity to transmission at the needed scale. What we mean by this phrase is power is great, but unless we have a means of getting that power to market, it's kind of pointless to us. So we need to have access to electrical transmission lines that are big enough to support the power output of the project. Now, for the most part, and again, this varies, but solar projects tend to be a little bit smaller, and so it's sometimes not as hard to find transmission lines that can support the power that they're kicking out. That gives you more options as to sites that are closer to transmission lines. But the larger the project, the larger the scale of transmission lines that are needed, and the fewer of those lines that there are. So it may be important to find land that's very close to the utility lines so that you don't have to build a lot of transmission lines simply to get the power to market. That's getting better as we continue to build out our transmission infrastructure. But one thing to consider is that historically, large-scale transmission lines have been located around population areas because that's where the electrical load was, so that's where there was more transmission line infrastructure in place. Now we find ourselves with more renewable resources that might actually be better in rural areas, and that means we may actually have to build more transmission to get to the market, and that means more project cost. Just like we mentioned, proximity to demand is also a factor. We want to have this power near to market, all of the things being equal. And so if we've got good open land that's got a good solar resource closer to a population center, that may mean that we have fewer transmission costs. So that might actually be more appealing than a slightly higher resource that's in a more remote area. So these are all the trade-offs that we have to think about if we're a developer. Then, of course, the closer that we get to population areas, the more likely we may be close to a zoned area, and some zoning systems may pose some obstacles for putting a solar project in place. About 40 states have some sort of statute in place that's meant to favor solar development, and what some of those states have done is basically enact a prohibition against local zoning ordinances that explicitly prohibit solar development. And you've seen some of this at state levels in hydraulic fracturing, where the state will basically enact a statute that says, we're going to regulate hydraulic fracturing at the state level, municipalities, that's off your plate now. And so lots of states have kind of done something similar, not exactly the same, but similar with respect to siting regulations for solar projects. I don't want to take you through an entire lecture on the physics of photovoltaic cells, so I'm going to make this very simple, very high level. If we're talking about a photovoltaic cell, or PV, that's what most people are thinking of when they think solar power in their heads. When you look at a satellite, for example, and it's got solar panels, or you look at the solar panels on your neighbor's roof, or you just think of a general solar panel, what you're probably picturing in your head is a PV, a photovoltaic cell. And the way that a photovoltaic cell works is it basically has a few sandwich layers with positive and negative charges, usually made out of silicon. And silicon works really well for solar applications because silicon atoms want to trade electrons with each other. And again, we won't delve too much in the chemistry or the physics, but just know that silicon electrons like to hop from one silicon atom to another. So that makes it easy to induce an electric current between those atoms if I can get some sort of energy to knock an electron off one atom and onto the next one. That's what a PV cell does. It sandwiches layers of that silicon together so that when a photon from sunlight enters the cell, it knocks an electron off one silicon atom to the next one, and that process of cascading electrons bouncing from one atom to the other creates an electrical current. That electrical current is captured by the system, and that's what generates our electricity. So what we're basically just doing with that in a utility scale project is scaling that up massively, so that we actually have a power flow that can support multiple homes, businesses, and so forth. So if you look at a PV array on a utility scale, you'll see modules of these solar cells mounted together. Most of the time they're on fixed mounts, but sometimes they're tracking mounts. And when we say tracking mount, we just means that the mount is going to keep that solar panel constantly perpendicular to the sun's rays, so it's always collecting the maximum amount of energy available. Those arrays are going to be strung together, and those strings will feed into collector or combiner boxes. Those combiner boxes then go together into an inverter that converts the DC power that's created from the modules into AC power, and then that's either fed to the grid or that may be put into battery storage. And battery storage is a technology that we'll talk about a little bit later. Battery storage could be a very big game changer for all renewables, and especially solar, because like we said, solar can be pretty variable given everything that happens with light in a given day. But if you had the ability to store that power and then dispatch it, that could be very valuable to the utilities and to consumers as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, if you want to see what a solar panel field looks like, a PV field in action, you'll see them all over the country and even all over the world. And you'll notice that sometimes they can even support a little bit of vegetation underneath them, because really they're usually mounted up off the ground. They need a little bit of elevation to make sure that, again, no plants on the ground really cause any sort of obstruction. And so there may be an opportunity for a little bit of agricultural use there. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Now, there are a couple of other solar systems out there that can be used for utility scale generation. A variation on PV is concentrated photovoltaic, or CPV. And the idea with that is that instead of having a larger cell, we have a very small cell that's much more efficient. And then we use a concentrator. Usually that's basically a lens that's located over the solar cell that further concentrates the light and really packs an intensive beam on a very efficient cell that might also be cooled by a heat sink or a liquid cooling system to really try to derive the absolute most energy out of that given location. And here are a couple of examples of some concentrated photovoltaic cells in action there. You'll notice they're a little bit thicker because you'll have a lens layer, a channel, and then the cell, and then a cooling area on the back. So CPV cells are a little bit thicker than just regular old PV cells there. Lots of times too, by the way, concentrated photovoltaic cells are going to be located on a tracking mount. So that mount is going to have a large pillar and a articulation frame that will constantly keep that cell moving, so that's always facing into the sun. Something you may be thinking about less when you're thinking about with solar power is concentrated solar power, or you might also hear this called solar thermal power. And here we're not using a PV cell to convert the photons from the sun into electrical power. What we're actually doing is using the heat from the sun to heat water. And this is just like good old-fashioned electrical generation from a heat source like coal or natural gas. You're using heat to convert water into steam. The steam drives through a turbine, and the turbine drives a generator. So with a concentrating solar power collector, you'll have a field of mirrors. Mirrors are usually called heliostats because, again, all these heliostats are going to be mounted on a tracking system that constantly keeps the sun focused on that receiver. Some fluid, which may be water directly or it may be something like a liquid sodium, is circulated through the receiver to capture that heat. That's used to create steam, which drives the turbine and the generator. Now that may be accomplished using a central collector, and that's an example of a central collector farm in California right there. Or you may also use parabolic troughs, and parabolic troughs are just curved reflectors that will reflect the sunlight onto a central tube that will carry the heat medium that goes to drive the steam that drives the turbine that drives the generator. And that's an example of what a parabolic trough looks like in action there. So when you're dealing with a solar thermal project, and this doesn't apply to PV projects, but if you're talking about a solar thermal project, And most of the time, by the way, if we're talking about that, we're talking about the southwest or the very south part of the country. Usually you don't see a lot of solar thermal projects in the northern parts of the country. But if you have a solar thermal project, water is a big issue because you got to have something to generate steam. So the first thing to ask yourself about a project like that is, what are the water requirements going to be? Exactly how many acre feet of water are we going to need per year to support this project? And if that's the case, if we're going to need that water, who has the rights to that, whether that's surface water or whether that's groundwater? And then, are those rights transferable? In some states they're not, in some states they're very freely transferable, but that's one thing you have to ask yourself is, how are we actually going to get this water from who owns it now to the project operator? What is that water worth? And by the way, that's not always an easy question to ask. If it's water that we're buying on the open market, what's the market price? And sometimes even that price data is not that easy to come by. But beyond that, lots of landowners, especially agricultural landowners, don't often stop to think about what the value of water is to their particular operation, which, by the way, might be worth more than the market rate. So if you do have to use water for irrigation or for other purposes on your farm, ask yourself, really economically, what is the value of that water, and am I paying market rate for it, or is there a disconnect there, and how much should I charge someone if I have to make it a zero-sum game, meaning that that's water they don't, or the water that I give them, that's water I don't use. That can be very important. So if you're a developer and you're thinking to yourself, I'd like to build a solar project, I need to first have access to land where I've got a solar resource, how do I go about doing that? And most of the time, if we're talking about some sort of legal agreement between an operator and a landowner, that's going to take one of two primary forms, and although you might also see these two forms hybridized together. The first is an easement, and just like I didn't want to take you guys to physics class, I don't want to make you sit through 6 credit hours of property rights, so we'll make this kind of short here. First off, if I'm talking about an easement is the right to make some sort of limited use of someone else's land, but I don't have the right to go on their land and completely possess it. I basically have the right to possess a small chunk of it, or I have the right to make some use of it without my presence actually being there. You've probably seen easements with respect to your own land, things like road easements, utility line easements. There's all sorts of easements that we come into in contact with everyday life. The thing about easements is that they can be limited in time, meaning we might say this easement lasts for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, or easements can be perpetual. For example, lots of access easements like road or transmission line easements may be designed specifically to go with the land, and so they may be potentially perpetual in duration. And so that's something that's different from leases, because leases cannot be perpetual. Easements can be non-exclusive, meaning that multiple people can make use of the property that's affected by an easement. And this is kind of the classic example for a rooftop solar easement. If someone wants to use your rooftop for solar development, you obviously still want to use your rooftop for other things as well. And that's one thing the easement can do, is allow multiple parties to use the same piece of land. Usually easements cannot be revoked without cause, and that kind of goes back to the nature that they can be really long-lasting and perhaps even perpetual. One party can't just decide, you know what, I want out of this easement. Usually it has to be mutual on the part of the parties, or there has to have been some sort of breach of the easement, an abuse basically, that causes the easement to end. Importantly, and this is a critical feature of liability issues, is that the person that has the easement may be responsible for what they or their employees or their guests do within the scope of the easement or with the use of the easement itself, but they're not responsible for the use of the property beyond the easement. And we're going to contrast that with leases here in just a second, okay? So, as we go through this then, if we're going to be engaging in an easement or any other type of land use really for a solar project, what are we looking for? At the utility scale, we need big, flat areas, because like we said, we need that large swath of unobstructed land. It needs to have a fairly shallow slope, because again, the angles matter. Although concentrated photovoltaic may actually use rougher terrain, they can actually articulate a little bit better because they're going to be on moving mounts. Rooftop solar, we care about where there's roofs. Again, you're thinking, wow, Ferrell, that's a tremendously profound statement. But roofs matter because we actually need to have some sort of supporting structure. And by the way, the higher that we mount the solar panels, the less opportunity that we have for obstructions, and also the less opportunity that we have for any sort of nuisance that may be caused to neighboring landowners. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation as well. If we're talking about land acquisition in the lease mode, this is a little bit different than easements, okay? If we're talking about a lease is a right to completely possess the land of someone else for a defined period of time. So let's contrast that with an easement for a second. Let's say that you have leased an apartment, okay? If you lease an apartment, you as the tenant have complete occupancy rights to that land. In other words, you have the right to be there. No one else has the right to be there. Even the landlord, if they want to enter the property that you've leased, they have to call and basically announce that they're coming first. So they can't just show up at any old time. You have the complete possession of that property. It's as though the landowner gave you the property completely for a limited period of time. And that's why developers like leases quite a bit, is because they get complete possession. They get the complete right to control what happens on that piece of property, so long as they've got the lease. Even the landowner in some states may have to explicitly reserve a right to enter the property. And I want you to think about that for a second. What we're saying here is that if I lease my land to someone, if I, as the landowner, want to enter that property that I own, I have to reserve that right in my lease. Otherwise, I don't have the right to enter that property because I've given it completely over to somebody else for a limited period of time. Now, that's going to become important when we talk about the ability for us to use the land that's given for a solar lease for agricultural purposes while the solar lease is still in effect. And we'll talk about that later. So the trade-off to that, and this is me kind of misappropriating a line from Spider-Man, but with great possession comes great responsibility. What I mean by that is that if you've leased land and you have complete possessory rights to it, you also have complete liability for anything that happens on the property as though you were the landowner. And this varies from state to some degree, but if we've turned over complete possession of the property to someone, that means that they're responsible for whatever happens on the property almost as though they were the landowner. Now, with a lease, like we said, they can't be perpetual like an easement can, but they can have a defined term, meaning this lease shall last for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, however the case might be. But we can say, you know what, this lease lasts 5 years, and the lease will automatically renew until one of us says otherwise. That's something that can be very flexible for the landowner and the tenant to say, hey, we'll just do this in 5-year stretches or 1-year stretches, and the lease will just renew until one of us opts out. The trick about it is, though, that if we're going to have a lease that's structured like that, someone does have to affirmatively opt out, or otherwise the lease just keeps on going and keeps on going. When we talk about what happens if someone purchases the land from the landowner while there's a lease in place, almost always the purchaser is going to take that land subject to the lease. And basically, in other words, they step into the shoes of the landowner. But two things. Number one, that's much easier to do if the lease has been recorded in the county land records. And that's something that the tenant is probably going to want to do. They're going to want everyone to be on notice that they have a lease to that property, so that if someone purchases it, they take it subject to that lease. The other thing is that the lease can change this rule. You can write your lease to say, if this land is transferred, then this lease is terminated. Now, that's kind of uncommon, and I guarantee you that that's not going to be part of a solar lease. The solar lease is almost always going to say that if the land is transferred, whoever takes the land has to take the land subject to this lease. And that's almost a guarantee right there. So if we look at how solar developers acquire land, it's almost always going to be through an easement or a lease. Generally speaking, they're not going to purchase the land. And that's a question lots of people have, and it's a legitimate question. Hey, if you're going to completely take the use of this land for the next 20 or 30 years, why in the world wouldn't you just buy the land from me? Why are you leasing it? Well, taxes, that's why. If we buy the land, that's not tax deductible. But if the land is leased, that is a tax deductible business expense, and so sometimes that can make some difference in the profitability of the project. For some larger scale projects, it may make more sense to buy, especially if we're talking about concentrating solar. access to water rights might be an issue. The intensity of the land use is an issue. And so they might want to purchase land from some time to time. But if we're talking about a PV-based project, we're almost always talking about a lease arrangement. Usually the times that you'll see easements is when you're looking at small rooftop photovoltaic systems or small scale ground mounted systems, and where they're really truly intending to share the use of the ground with someone else. And really, if you're talking about utility scale projects, lots of times what you'll see is a combination. You'll see a possessory lease that kind of takes the land use, but you may also see some access easements or some other easements that kind of supplement that possessory use of the lease. So some of the larger agreements that you see might actually have elements of both leases and easements to them, okay? If you're a developer, and we've kind of already talked about this, but again, we're trying to figure out what land should we even acquire to build this project, you're really kind of facing a balancing act. You know, you might want to oversimplify and say, look, I just need to find a place that actually has the absolute best solar year-round. That's what drives project revenues. That's what gets us money in our pocket. But at the same time, we've got to also think about our costs. And so the further away I am from access to the transmission grid, the further away I am from access to markets, that increases my project costs. And so what we're really trying to do is optimize our net profits, which means we're trying to have high revenues, but we're also trying to minimize costs. And so that's the balancing act that every developer kind of tries to go through there. Okay, so we've talked about kind of trying to figure out where we should put this project. Now let's start talking about the questions that we need to ask ourselves if someone approaches us, wow, sorry with the slight lisp there. If someone approaches us with a potential solar energy lease. And like we said, there's 5 questions. How will my property use be affected? How long is the agreement going to last? What are my obligations as a landowner? How am I going to get paid? And what happens when the project is over? So let's talk about land use. And, you know, I think other than talking to landowners about the payment terms, this is the concern that I think it's most frequently expressed to me when we're talking about anything, whether it's oil and gas, wind, or solar. Am I still going to be able to use my property? And if so, how and to what extent? So let's talk about this for a second. If you're the developer, like we said, we first off have to have a good site, and we've already talked about the siting considerations, but let's say I've found a site that I think is pretty good. What's next, okay? The next thing I want to do is figure out, can I really intensively examine the resource here? I might need to put in place, for example, a few data measuring stations. I might actually need to put a few solar cells into an area to actually collect data on the site. As a matter of fact, I can almost guarantee that my banker is going to want that. For most renewable energy projects, the lending institutions that provide credit to the projects are going to want to see at least one solid year, 365 days, and maybe 2 or 3 to confirm that the resource in an area is what people expected it to be. So they're going to have to be able to access the land. They're also going to have to be able to conduct a survey because they have to start putting together construction plans, and they're probably going to have to stake things out and do everything they would, you know, if you were any sort of developer building any sort of structure, doing that initial survey work in the area. Let's say that they've decided to build in the area, then the next thing that they're going to want is the ability to access the property during construction. And it's important to remember that the construction phase of a project is going to be the most intensive phase. Once a solar project is in place, it's really fairly easy to maintain. There's not many moving parts unless we have a tracking mount system, but really it kind of just sits there and collects sunlight. So it's fairly quiet during the operations phase, but during construction, there's a lot of vehicular traffic, there's a lot of people on site. The actual footprint of the project may be bigger because there may be construction roads that eventually go away, there may be storage areas. So that's one thing that's going to affect land access, is that we might actually need to have more property for the project while it's in the construction phase than we're actually going to need during operation. Like we just said, once construction's over, things kind of quiet down quite a bit, and there's still going to be a need for access to the property to make sure that the operations are going as they need to perform maintenance as it's necessary, and of course you're going to have some routine maintenance and some maintenance that occurs whenever there's a breakdown. And those breakdowns, like we said, are more frequent if we're talking about a project that has actively moving mounts versus a fixed mounted project. With rooftop applications, this is something people don't think about. Sometimes stuff breaks outside of 8 to 5. And especially when we're talking about solar applications, if I can do maintenance when it's not sunny, that's the best time to do it because I'm not going to be interfering with power generation. So if you have someone that's renting a rooftop for panel access, they are very likely going to need to have access outside of normal business hours, which may mean that they need to have access to the building, access to security systems. And so that's something that you need to have a little bit of a level of comfort with if you do want to have a rooftop system installed. Then, of course, we're going to have a need for a right-of-way for the connector lines. And like we said, connector or collector lines connect the solar modules together. Then those will feed likely to a substation that's going to step the power up to the voltage that's needed for transmission. And then we'll actually have probably overhead transmission lines carrying that power to market. And last but certainly not least, remember, unobstructed sunlight is kind of the name of the game here. So let's talk about how much land is actually occupied by a solar project. And to give you a little bit of contrast here, I wanted to show you an example from Oklahoma. We recently did a comprehensive mapping project for all of the wind energy projects in Oklahoma. And by that, I mean we literally mapped every turbine, every road, every transmission substation, everything for every wind energy project in the state. The quarter section that I'm showing you here is the most intensively used quarter section in the state of Oklahoma for wind power, and it's got 4 turbines located into it. So if you measure the yellow area that you see here, that's 156.8 acres, which, you know, most quarter sections should be about 160 acres, so we've got a little bit of measurement error here. But that's the area of the field that we're looking at. But if you look at how much of that land is actually taken out of production, that's only 3.85 acres, meaning that out of this field, we've only used less than 3%, actually about 2.5% of that land. So that's the amount of land that's under gravel or under concrete and it isn't accessible to us. All the rest of this land is accessible for agricultural production. Now, that's a pretty stark contrast to when we're talking about a solar project. This is a solar project from Hagerstown, Maryland, and I picked intentionally the most intensive field in this entire project. So judging from the land mass used, more of this field is taken up by the panels than any of the other fields associated with this project. If you look here, the total area of the field is 15.51 acres. The area actually used, occupied by the panels, the transformer pads, and the road is 6.81 acres for a use ratio here of 43.9%. So much higher than wind, but that still leaves, you know, over half of the land area that actually could be used for something. Now the question is, can we use that land for something? And as you look at this field, you pretty much figure out right off the bat that crop use is out. You know, about the only thing that we could use this land for otherwise would be for limited grazing. Is the developer going to be willing to do that? We'll have to ask that question. If you look at solar, solar land use, as you can see from this chart, is anywhere between 2 acres per megawatt capacity on the low end, up to about 9 acres per megawatt of capacity on the high end. And so there is some land intensity associated here. So your question is, can I use that land that's not being physically occupied by the modules or the support systems for something else? The developer's gut reaction is going to be, no, I want to have complete total occupancy of that land because that gives me the maximum control and lets me make sure that I can, to the best of my ability, minimize the opportunity for disruptions to the operation caused by someone or something else being on the land. That's why, like we said, for most developers, they're going to choose the lease model because that gives them full possession. Now, again, that's in stark contrast to wind projects. You know, wind projects all over the country frequently, you know, see use for either livestock operations or for crop operations with really little interference there. Another reason that developers like to have exclusive use is because they control when they go on and who else goes on the land. They don't have to provide notice to the landowner that they're going to enter the land, and they can restrict any other third parties from entering as well. So if you look at other sorts of renewable systems like wind, livestock, you know, are frequently found anywhere around a wind energy project because there's plenty of other land to be used. But that's not to say that we can't have livestock around solar projects. And in fact, the most common species of choice for coextensive use with solar are sheep and goats. And why, do you ask? Two reasons. Number one, they're short. Number two, they like to graze the stuff around them. Why does being short matter? Usually, solar panels will be mounted a little bit above ground, and frequently that's anywhere from 4 or more feet off the ground. And part of the reason for that, you'll recall, is that they want to make sure there's no vegetation obstructions to the panels. Well, you know what else helps with vegetation obstructions? Stuff that eats vegetation. And so goats and sheep are sometimes allowed to graze in areas where there are solar installations because they keep the vegetation mowed down effectively. But number two, they're short, meaning that they won't bump into the solar panel mounts and potentially cause damage there. Now, that's not always a lead pipe cinch. You're not always going to have the opportunity for grazing on solar areas. But there is the possibility for that, especially if we're talking about above ground mounted PV systems. Of course, if we're talking about rooftop mounted PV, there's all sorts of other opportunities for coextensive land use there. The moral of the story, and the thing that we want to take away from this discussion point here, is if you're going to have the opportunity for shared use, if your developer is willing to consider that and say, yeah, I'll let you make some agricultural use of the property in the same area and the same field where our equipment's going to be located, then make sure that's explicitly protected in the written agreement. It needs to be actually explicitly stated that the landowner can continue to use the property for this type of grazing under these circumstances, etc., etc. By the way, everything we're going to talk about tonight, get that in writing. It's a mantra that I teach all my undergrads. It's a mantra that I speak every time I give a presentation. Get everything in writing. The landmen may make tremendous promises to you, and that's great, so long as it's actually incorporated into the written lease agreement that you actually sign. So, because we're using lots of land, what are the consequences here? Well, like we said, the developer wants to maximize how much land they actually have under their direct control. That gives them more siting flexibility. That also gives them some setbacks. Like we said, we're trying to keep obstructions and damage far away from the solar panels here. So setback distances mean that no one else can build a building, hopefully, that will obstruct our panels, or install a shelter belt or something like that might cause shadowing. But another thing that Paul and Tiffany Dowell and I were just talking about today are examples of things like crop spraying. The developer may not want aerial crop spraying to occur too close to the panels because that causes particulates to get onto the panels that can cause obstructions and lower their efficiency that may require cleaning. So that's just another example of the need for buffer areas to be located around the project so that there isn't the opportunity for obstructions to interfere with the operation of the panels. If you're the landowner, you kind of want the exact opposite. You want to minimize how much land the developer is actually controlling and maximize how much you can actually retain for your agricultural operations. So if you've got a field, like the example that we showed, where there's about 43% of the land being used, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I can still use the rest of that land for grazing, the developer might say, no, I need complete control of that area. If you're going to lease it to me, I want complete possession of it. If that's the case, and we're completely losing that land use, well, then we probably have to have an increase in the rent to compensate for that. Given that, some developers might say, you know what, I want to find land that, all of the things being equal, has the lowest alternative use value. In other words, it's got very little agricultural use, it has very little developmental use, so let's try to get access to that land as cheaply as possible. But again, like we said, there's all sorts of other siting factors that may work against that as well. So in the lease agreement, what you're basically trying to do is, as closely as you can, define what areas are going to be under developer control and try to maximize how much area is still under the landowner's control. We've got, kind of loggerheads here. We've got the developer that wants one thing, we have a landowner that wants almost the opposite thing. How do we reconcile those? Well, there are a couple of options that we could consider. Number one, we could define a specific minimal rent rate for land that's exclusively occupied by the developer. And the developer is probably likely to say, well, if I went out and leased that land for agricultural use, for example, for grazing for cattle or goats or whatever, what would that lease for? Now, that's probably what they're thinking, but the landowner's probably thinking, well, this isn't grazing, though. This is a much more disruptive, much more intensive use. We need to be charging something that's a little bit above agricultural lease rates. What some developers will do then is define an annual minimum rent and then also provide an opportunity for a royalty payment. We see this model a lot in wind energy, for example. There will be a minimum rent payment, and then there will be a royalty payment that's defined for the landowner as a certain percentage of the power sale revenues. In other words, if we generate $100,000 in net sales from this turbine, we'll give you, landowner, X percent of those revenues as a royalty, and if that's more than the minimum annual rent, we'll pay you the higher amount. By the way, lots of people want to say, well, they charge a 4% royalty in wind energy. Isn't that what they should charge for solar? Not necessarily, because the economics of solar are a little bit different. The capacity factor is a little bit different. And we're still trying to figure out what those market rates are for solar, and it hasn't quite evolved yet. There just aren't enough data points, but we're working on it. One thing that's also really important is that in as much as it's possible, landowners make sure that you have the right to consult with a developer as to the siting of the project and to the configuration of the project. And this is getting to be better and better in wind. We're hoping that we can kind of learn some of those lessons with solar much more quickly and establish better dialogue and communications to minimize the amount of land use while maximizing the amount of power provided. Finding that optimal mix faster by getting the landowner and the developer to actually talk to each other. And you might see lots of agreements that say, yeah, we'll talk to the landowner, but we reserve the absolute utter discretion to do whatever the heck we want after we've had that consultation, which is kind of meaningless for the landowner. So if you can get it, language that says the developer will consult with the landowner, and as long as the landowner's suggestions are commercially reasonable or commercially feasible, or having some sort of limiting language like that, that's much better than saying, yeah, we'll listen to you, but we'll do whatever we want to in the end. Phase development might also be an approach that we can use here. When we talk about phase development, what we mean is that we might have a developer who leases a larger amount of land first, but then as that land is no longer required, they release it back to the landowner. So they might lease, for example, 50 acres for a project, but once they've done their siting analysis and they've actually done construction, they've learned they only use 30 acres. So the rest of that land amount is turned back over to the landowner, and that has the function of basically shrinking the land back to its minimum size. Whenever we talk about land use, we always have to talk about a few geometric factors. How closely can the landowner get to an obstacle? Here, for example, is a meteorological data tower, and you can see that this wheat farmer in Oklahoma really wanted to get the absolute maximum amount out of this land. Now, the question is, did they actually save themselves money or cost themselves money by trying to farm as closely as they could to this obstacle? That's another webinar there about land use efficiency, but the reason that we point this out is simply to say, when you've got an obstruction in your farming operation, that has some incidental costs, and you need to pencil those through. When someone is approaching you for solar development, they may ask for several easements, and we kind of talked about this, the easements that may also accompany a lease arrangement. One of the first things you might see, for example, is a requirement for an access easement. An access is pretty much what it implies. This is an easement that gives the developer the right to come across your property to access the actual solar field. And let me see if I can get my pen to work here. So, for example, this area right here, oh, nope, just kidding. Here we are. If you see this area right here, this is an access road that is in place outside of the actual field where the solar panels are located. And so that's something that we would have to have an access easement for. We're having to go across the property to actually get to where the, it says turbine areas here, I apologize, the panel areas are. So access is a lot of times combined with construction easements, right? So not only do we have access to the actual area where the panels are located, but we've also got perhaps staging areas. That might be areas where we lay down or store equipment until it's actually configured onto the project. It obviously includes access to all the areas of the project and maybe some areas outside the project area, at least while construction's going on. And then once construction is complete, those access areas are shrunk back. When we're talking about transmission easements, a couple of things we have to think about here. When we're talking about transmission, first off, we likely have underground connector lines that connect the modules together, maybe to some substations, and then collect that to the project substation. Then, of course, you do have the substation itself. That's going to have lots of above-ground power conversion equipment. And then you're probably going to have overhead transmission lines that go from the substation to the utility grid proper. So with a PV project, you're probably going to see both underground transmission and above ground transmission. You're probably going to see different compensation rates for both of those easements because there are different levels of land intensity associated with either one of those. You might also see something called a non-obstruction easement. And when we say a non-obstruction, what we're saying is you agree that you're not going to do anything on neighboring property that will create a shadow or other sort of impact to the PV cells. So that may mean no buildings. It may also mean no shelter belts or other objects that are going to throw shadows onto the panels. And by the way, you might not be the only people, that are being asked for these non-obstruction agreements. Obviously you, as the landowner entering the agreement with the developer, don't want to have any sort of obstructions, but also the developer may be going to neighboring landowners and offering them a small amount of compensation to sign a non-obstruction easement as well. Then there may be a nuisance or aesthetic easement, essentially that says you agree not to complain if, for example, the panels project glare or reflections off of the panels onto neighboring properties. And that's not really as big of an issue as people might think, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But just for the sake of safety, lots of times the developer will want an agreement from you, the landowner, to say, if we're going to pay you for this lease, you agree that you're not going to sue us for some sort of negligence claim or nuisance claim based on the fact that we have some sort of a glare or reflective impact on your residence or any other sort of structures that are located on the property. If there's going to be any sort of damages that occur during the construction of the operations phase, one thing we want to think about up front is how do we want to compensate that? And the easier that we can make that, the more empirical we can make that, and the more objective we can make that, that's probably better for everybody. So if we've got, for example, damage to growing crops, that's something we can probably provide up front in the agreement, is to say, look, for every acre of crop damaged, here's how we're going to figure out the compensation for that. We're going to look at the 5-year historical yield average, we're going to look at the nearby futures price, and we're going to use those two factors together to define what the crop loss was that was foregone. Or we're going to use the insured value of that crop, or some other metric that's easy for both parties to take a look at. That's really all you got. Figure out some sort of empirical way to address that issue there. Oh, sorry, here we go. Let's advance the slide there. How does the agreement handle blocking crop or livestock production for a season? And this probably isn't going to be as big of an issue with solar because the construction area isn't going to be a whole lot bigger than the actual operational area. There's going to be a little bit of shrink there, but not a whole lot. If we've got to block the land off for construction, let's say we've got a laydown yard or something like that, are we going to be paid some sort of compensation for that loss of that field for that specific grazing season? Ways we can do this is we can have a schedule. If we have an injury to livestock, we can basically almost have like a workers' compensation schedule for the livestock. If you injure an animal of this type, it's worth this. If you injure an animal of this type, it's worth that. We can have a schedule per acre. All sorts of different ways that we can do it. We just need to make sure that's as objective as we can get it. Anytime we're talking about prices, how are we going to define price? Are we going to set it up front? If we do that, that's good, that's objective, but it may also change with the market over time. If we're going to go after market prices, what do we mean when we say market? Do we mean the nearby cash market? Do we need a USDA price report? Do we need the nearby futures contract price? How are we going to go about establishing that price measure there? So that's our land use. Let's talk about how long the agreement will last. And, I'll just give you a little bit of a contrasting story from my experience in wind energy. When it comes to wind energy, the first lease I reviewed, which was back in 2005, was a 150-year lease. Now, to give you some perspective, if you'd signed that lease at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, that lease would have expired last year in 2015. So that's a bit long, and the wind energy industry figured out pretty fast that landowners were going to balk at leases that long. So they quickly pared that back all the way to 50 years, which is still a pretty long time, but it's way shorter than 150. Why do developers want leases that last so long? Well, to use an old adage, the resource is where you find it. If I found an area with a vein of gold, right, I want to hold on to the right to mine that gold for as long as there is gold there until I mine it all out. So that's, some period less than forever when we're talking about a finite resource. But if I found a place with great solar resources or great wind resources, those resources could potentially last forever. So ideally, if I'm the developer, I want a lease that lasts forever because that's where the resource is. If I'm a landowner, I don't want that. Matter of fact, if I could, I'd like to put that lease on eBay every other day if I could, because if there's someone else that's willing to pay me a little bit more, I want to kick the old guy off and bring the new guy on. Well, those two things just simply aren't compatible. It can't be forever and it can't be every other day. So how do you come to some sort of compromise for that? When we're talking about solar leases, that usually leads us to a lease that's 20 to 30 years long. And you may see some leases that are longer than that, but they seem to be kind of shrinking back to this level. Why 20 to 30 years? Well, first off, many project developers are selling power to the utility under a power purchase agreement, or a PPA. And the PPA is good for the developer in that it guarantees a marketplace and a purchaser for that power in that utility. It's good for the utility because the utility knows that it has access to this power at a set price, so it doesn't have to go up and down with the market. So these power purchase agreements can have lots of durations. Some of them last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And so if there is a power purchase agreement in place between the developer and a utility, the lease has to last as long as the power purchase agreement does, because otherwise they're going to have a lot of exposure there. So that's one important reason. Number two, the developer may be using debt financing to cover some of this project, and they've got to make sure that they have the cash flows from the project at least as long as their debt is in place to make sure they can cash flow those payments. And last, but certainly not least for the developer, they're going to have a pretty significant amount of fixed investment in the project, and the longer they can make the lease, the greater their opportunity to recoup as much of that fixed investment back as they can. Now, we said that lots of these lease agreements look like they're 20 to 30 years long, but sometimes that's not explicit. Sometimes, for example, we've got a developer that has a power purchase agreement that lasts 10 years, but they've asked for a lease that has a 10-year initial period with 3 or 4 or 5 renewal periods at 5-year increments. So you have to add all that up. If they're developer-only options, meaning the developer has the option to trigger them, but the landlord does not have the option to say, no, thank you, you basically have to tack that on and assume that the developer is going to execute those when you're trying to figure out how long your land's going to be under that obligation. So what are those renewal periods? How long do they last? When are they triggered? Are you going to get notice of the renewal? Or is the notice simply that, well, we're still here, so we must have renewed it, right? Last, and certainly not least on this point as well, is do you have the option to reopen the lease at renewal? And most leases won't allow that. When we say reopen, what we mean is, gosh, the electrical market has changed in the past 15 years. Don't you think it's fair that we renegotiate the price terms of this agreement because the market simply just doesn't look like it did when we entered this thing in the first place? Now, some of the more progressive leases will recognize that and say, you know what? We agree that we will use commercially reasonable, quote, quote, terms to renegotiate the lease if we operate in a renewal period. And some leases define that in many different ways. Some say that we'll try to negotiate a agreement that is at the basic same economic level as the current agreement was, given the market conditions now. Some agreements say we both agree, developer and landowner, that we'll go to a third party for mediation or arbitration to determine what's a fair market rate at that point in the future. Lots of options there. We just want to try to make sure that you're keeping things as fair as you possibly can. What are the landowner's obligations? If you've got a solar lease on your property, what do you have to do? A few things you need to think about are indemnification, first and foremost. What's indemnification, other than a fancy lawyer word and a triple word score in Scrabble? Indemnification means that you're going to basically defend the other party for something that happens on the property. So if someone comes onto the property that you've invited and they damage some of the solar equipment, you agree under the indemnification clause that you will pay the developer for the damage to that equipment. Some agreements are very even-handed about that, and they say, hey, if it's someone under our control and they cause damage to the property, we'll absorb that ourselves, says the developer. Landowner, if it's someone that you invite onto the property or it's someone that's your employee, okay, you agree that you'll be responsible for them. And if it's a trespasser, we agree that that person was under neither of our control and insurance is going to have to cover that. That's the even-handed way of doing it. Now, I have seen some agreements that go pretty heavily the other way and say, look, if it's not us, speaking on the developer's part, then it must be you, landowner. Even if it's a trespasser, you agree to indemnify us. You know, that doesn't seem really fair. So watch for that kind of indemnification language. Another thing to think about is, will your insurance coverage provide you with protection for an indemnification agreement? Here's an example. Let's say we had a solar project in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, a crop and pasture practice that we use from time to time is prescribed burning, where we'll actually have a controlled burn of a field to kind of return some nutrients back to the soil and revitalize the vegetative growth. Well, what happens if our prescribed burn gets out of control and burns some of the solar power equipment? Will our general liability coverage on our farm cover that? Answer, tough to say. Depends on the policy, and some policies might say, nope, that's well beyond the scope of what we insured you for. So just make sure that whatever you're signing up for in terms of an indemnification agreement, that you have the ability to actually live up to that indemnification agreement should it actually be triggered. Property taxes are another important issue. And in most of the jurisdictions I've examined, the renewable energy equipment is regarded as being the personal property of the developer or the project owner and not personal property of the landowner. Now that's important because that means that the developer or operator should be paying the property taxes that are caused by that property being there. In some states, though, I have seen landowners actually get dinged for actually seeing increases in property values, and they have to pay the property taxes and then seek reimbursement from the developer. You don't want that to happen. You want to make sure that the developer is paying directly the property taxes on their part. Now, another thing that you might also see in your agreement is you might see an obligation that you provide the developer with your property tax records. And you might think to yourself, why do they care about my property taxes? Well, they care because they want to make sure that you're paying your property taxes. And if you don't pay your property taxes, they run the risk of your property basically being seized by the county or the state, and they potentially lose access to that land. They don't want that to happen. So what you might see in some solar leases is a requirement that A, you submit your tax documentation to them, B, you agree that you'll pay your property taxes on time, and C, that if you don't pay your property taxes, they'll pay your property taxes for you and hold that out of your payment. So you just need to make sure that you examine all that language and make sure you're comfortable with that. Subordination of property interests we're going to talk about in another slide here in just a second, so we're going to skip that for right now. But another thing to think about is USDA program compliance. If you've got land that's in CRP, EQIP, WIP, or any of the other Farm Bill programs, you need to make sure that you ask for permission rather than forgiveness. What I mean by that is that most of the USDA regs have provisions that will allow you to make use of land under contract for renewable energy projects. And at worst, what they'll do is simply say, all right, that's not a qualified use. What we're going to do is just release that land from the contract, but we're not going to hold you in breach of the contract. At best, they might say, you know what, we can work out a reconciliation plan here so that you can continue to have the land under contract. You don't have to drop anything out. So that's the best way to handle that. If you sign up your land for this development, though, and you don't ask for permission in advance, you could be found to be deliberately in breach of your contract. That can result in you forfeiting payments, or could even result in you paying back payments that you've already received. So just be very careful about that. We talked about subordination a second ago. Let's talk about some title issues here, okay? Lots of times when you're presented with a solar lease or easement, you're going to see something in there called a subordination clause, or a SDNA clause, or something like that. And what the developer is concerned about with that is to make sure that no one else that has an interest in this property interferes with them having the access to the property. So, for example, if you have a mortgage on the property and the bank has to foreclose, the developer wants to make for darn sure that that foreclosure does not operate to kick them off of the property. So what they may try to do is try to subordinate that mortgage. And what does that mean? Basically what they're asking is, we want to get everyone else who has a claim to this land, whether it's someone else with a lease, someone else with a mortgage, etc., we want them to agree that when they have a right to the property, they won't use that right to kick us off. Now, in those terms, that sounds pretty reasonable. But functionally, what you're saying is, someone that may have a superior right to this property, we want you to get in line behind us. And especially if you're asking your lender, who you've had a good relationship with for many years, to kind of get in line behind this guy that just came along all of a sudden, they might react with a little bit of anger to that. They might not want to be asked to get in a line behind someone else who has an inferior right to them. So what you want to do is just understand that if I enter into this solar development agreement, whether it's lease, easement, or otherwise, do I still have the ability to sell my property if I need to? Do I still have the ability to mortgage it, to gain access to the equity that I have in it through some sort of lending program? Make sure you don't have any language in the agreement that would basically operate to preclude you from doing that, because that can be really important to you as an agricultural operator. So make sure that you clearly define those interests, and don't agree to a subordination agreement if you don't feel comfortable with it. You know, lots of times the lease might say, hey, you agree and you will help us get this subordination agreement from everyone that has an interest in the property, including your lender. What might be preferable for you to say is, I agree, developer, I'm not going to get in your way, and I'll cooperate with you, but I'm not going to be the one asking those lenders or those other parties to subordinate their interest, because I just don't really feel comfortable doing that. One thing we run into a lot here in Oklahoma, and you might run into it in other states as well, is the conflict, if you will, between the mineral estate and the surface estate when it comes to renewable energy development. And I just think this is funny, because I remember as a wee child, my mother watched one program on television religiously, and that was Dallas. By gosh, when it was 8 o'clock on Friday nights, the Ferrell family would watch Dallas. And in the old days, JR, of course, was the oil magnate, and Bobby was thinking, hey, there's this new thing called solar power. We need to diversify our interest and go into solar. And that was, of course, a huge topic of debate between the Ewing family, and caused lots of drama and made for good television, right? Well, we still see those issues today. They're just in a slightly different context. If you recall those pictures that I showed you of the solar fields a little bit earlier, you can see that you've pretty much occupied a big chunk of the property. So there's not a lot of room around there to do anything else that's fairly intensive. Like we said, we could probably graze some small animals, but there's not a lot of room in that field, for example, for there to be an oil and gas well pad. So if we've occupied the land for solar use, we may have blocked that specific piece of land for development for oil and gas use. Now, that doesn't mean that all oil and gas resources in the area are blocked off forever. That's not the case at all. Rather, we're probably going to have to drill somewhere else. If it's a really expansive field, we may have to use directional drilling, which is getting to be more and more of the norm anyway, but that is an added expense for the oil and gas developer. So one thing you've got to remember is that when you're the landowner or you're the solar developer, when you come onto that property, you have to take that land subject to whatever interests are already there. For example, surface owner, if you buy land that does not have the mineral estate attached to it, you have a subordinated estate to the minerals, meaning the mineral estate has the right to use part of the surface to extract oil, gas, and other hydrocarbons. That creates a potential for some conflict there then. Lots of times the developer will try to push the management of that conflict back to the surface owner to say, hey, if the mineral owner throws a fit about us having a solar project here, you're going to hold us harmless and you're not going to enter into any other sort of agreement that could potentially interfere with our use of the surface. Now that sounds all well and good, but if you're the surface owner, you don't have any control over how the mineral estate conducts its affairs. You can't make any representations about what the mineral estate's going to do. So the lesson for the landowner here is that if you are a severed surface owner, don't sign off on anything that obligates you to have control over the mineral estate because you just don't have it. Now, if you own both the surface and the minerals, you do have control over the minerals, and so it's on you then to make sure that there is no interference between the mineral estate and the surface estate when it comes to the solar development. How does a landowner get paid? And oh my goodness, I wish I had better information for you. And this market information has been 10 years in development in the wind energy industry, and arguably longer than that. We're just really early on in the expansion of the solar industry, so we really don't have good market data for you, and I really do apologize for that. I wish I had those numbers. But I can kind of give you a framework for analyzing this. And first thing is simply, what are your payments? It's likely that you're going to see some sort of payment for the easements that you're issuing, those access easements, construction easements, nuisance easements, et cetera, Understand what your payments, what your basis for those payments are, okay? Sorry, let me go back here for a second. Are we being paid, for example, if we're talking about roads, are we being paid per foot, per rod, chain, furlong, league, kilometer, whatever the case might be? And if I'm being paid on a linear basis, let's say I'm getting a certain amount of payment per foot, okay, that's all well and good, but I need to understand the width of that easement. If I'm getting $2 per foot, that makes a big difference as to whether or not I'm issuing a 25-foot wide easement, 50 foot, 100 foot, 200 feet. That's a big deal, okay? So understand the denominations for your easements, and also understand how many easements we're stacking. For example, is it more important to you to have a payment for the easements, or do you want to have the easements take up as little space as possible? Classic example here is, do I want to include language in the agreement that says, hey, developer, if it's at all possible, can you co-locate the underground lines, for example, or the overhead lines for that matter, with the roads so that we're taking up the minimum footprint possible? That's something we want to think about. And again, like we said, market data is really tough for us to come up with on the solar side of things. To the extent that you can find it, though, kind of use that as a starting point. And then understand what your lease payments are. And this is really difficult because, again, we're talking about a very intensive land use. And the agricultural lease rate is probably not a very good comparison. This probably needs to be something that's at a fairly significant premium to the agricultural use of the property, because we're basically losing the use of the property completely during the period of the lease. Again, of course, if we can have some shared use, that kind of mitigates that. But a very intensive use, an industrial use that has a few more hazards than just usual agricultural use, okay? So you need to understand what's the base payment going to be. Is that payment based on an acreage? Is it based on a capacity? Is it based on a royalty, or is it a combination of those things? When we're talking about acreages, for example, definitions clearly matter there as to, are we talking about the acreage of the field that's described in the lease? Are we talking about the acreage that's actually under panel? You know, how do we define that actual acreage use? How do we define the start date? How do we define the end date? These are all things we need to very clearly understand and that have very clearly delineated in the lease agreement. If we're talking about a royalty, you know, we're getting a defined percentage of the revenues from the project. Boy, oh boy, do we need to define gross revenues or whatever those terms are very, very carefully. And a couple of examples of this. I saw one lease, for example, that defined the royalty in terms of a percent of the net profit to the developer. Folks, let me tell you, there are all sorts of things you can do to manipulate net profit, okay? So that's kind of a bad measure to use. Gross revenue is a little bit easier to objectively define, but even that has some issues. For example, if we're talking about gross revenue, are we just talking about purely the amount of money that we get from a payment of power from this project without any sort of deductions? Deductions are a huge issue in oil and gas, for example, but there can be deductions with electrical generation as well. We could have wheeling charges, tariff costs. We can have curtailment payments, or curtailment fees, rather, excuse me. All sorts of things that can go into calculating what the actual the gross revenues from power sales are. But perhaps the biggest issue when we're talking about renewable projects and gross revenues is whether environmental attributes are included in that number. What the heck is an environmental attribute? What we're referring to there is sometimes also called a green tag or a renewable energy credit or REC. But basically, for example, if you get any sort of environmental credit from the generation of power from a renewable source, some leases will include that in the calculation of gross revenues, some will not. When you include those payments, that increases the size of the pie that you get, and that can be really important for lots of landowners. So make sure that you very clearly understand what is and isn't included in that definition. How are you going to figure out whether you're being paid correctly? And for example, if we're getting a revenue-based payment, one of the easiest ways for us to have some level of verification of that is, number one, have access to the power purchase agreement. So will the developer share the power purchase agreement with you to show what their payments received are going to be? And two, having a meter at the project that can be accessed by the landowner so that they can see how much power has been generated by the project. Now, the developer could make that fairly easy for you in providing you a payment statement. In other words, when you get your check, they'll say, hey, here's our meter readings. Here is the price that we received. Here's how we calculated your payment. Here you go. Okay. Now, that's very good to have, but one thing you also need to make sure that you can do is reserve the right to audit that payment. Make sure that you preserve the right to have access to all of the records that you need to have access to in order to verify that amount. Some of the more sophisticated landowners will also include a clause that says, if I find an error greater than a fixed percentage, some cases that might be 2, some cases that might be 4%. But if I find an error greater than that amount, not only do you have to correct the payment to me, but you're also going to pay for the audit, and you're also going to pay me interest on the difference. Now, that's good work if you can get it, but you got to have a lot of negotiating power to do that. What happens when the project is all said and done? Are we going to have old dirty panels out there, or are we actually going to get these things cleaned up, right? Well, it's a good idea to make sure in your agreement that there's a requirement to decommission the project. And decommissioning is a fancy word for saying we're going to wrap up the project neatly, we're going to remove the equipment, we're going to restore the land to the best condition that we can. One of the first requirements there is to make sure the equipment is properly disassembled and removed so we don't have old, dilapidated equipment out there on our property that's decreasing our property values. We probably also want to restore the grades of the soils and the soil quality in as much as we can to make sure that we return the land as close as possible to its pre-construction condition. We probably also want to include the reestablishment of vegetation. And when I say reestablishment, I don't mean reseeding. Reseeding simply means we'll throw seed out there. During a drought period and without a proper seed bed, that just basically means that you are feeding the birds, okay? So we say reestablish, we mean you're going to reestablish a seed bed, you're going to drill the seed into the soil, you're going to provide water and fertilizer for as long as necessary until the vegetation is back to an established state. In addition to all this is something that we're talking about that could take place, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future. There's a lot of financial uncertainty between here and there. So another thing that we might try to seek is some sort of bond or other sort of financial assurance that we can go against in the event that the developer does not make good on their obligation to decommission the land properly. In other words, if the developer flakes out and leaves, we have some sort of financial instrument that we can use to finance the proper decommissioning of the land. We've seen that a lot in wind in the form of security bonds. We are still kind of developing that concept in solar, but I kind of think we're going to see that relatively soon. those are our 5 questions. Real quickly, and I know that we're running near the end of our time here, but I did want to talk about a couple of other related issues to solar development. And we've seen these questions, so I wanted to go ahead and address them. No, solar panels don't suck up the sun from the area around them. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Solar panels are designed to absorb light. They only generate power from light they absorb. So solar panels are specifically designed to not reflect any more light than they have to, okay? So obviously, yes, solar panels absorb light, but some people are worried that they suck light in from surrounding areas, and it just ain't so. That is not the case. Solar panels only collect light that actually flows directly into them. So your plants and everything else will still grow. You can still see inside your house. That's okay. They will not suck up the sun from the surrounding areas. Anytime there's any sort of energy technology, I always have to ask, does this thing cause cancer? No, it does not. Well, solar energy does cause skin cancer, but that's when you're standing in the sun, not when you're standing next to a solar panel. So no, solar panels do not cause cancer. Do they impact property values? I've been going through the peer-reviewed research, and I haven't yet found a study that specifically dealt with solar power. That study may be out there yet, but I haven't found it yet. What I can tell you is that the Berkeley National Lab has done a pretty extensive study on the impact of wind turbines and land values, and found that there really wasn't a statistically significant impact on land values from turbine projects. And I would also say, too, that turbine projects are a lot more aesthetically noticeable, perhaps, than solar projects, just because towers are much, much taller. And solar projects are generally very close to ground or on rooftops. So I would suspect, my researcher gut tells me that there's probably not much of a property impact from the solar development there. Nuisance issues. We talked kind of about this. We talked about reflection and glare just a second ago. So remember, solar panels are meant to absorb energy. And as a matter of fact, most solar panels have anti-reflective coatings specifically so they can absorb more energy and not reflect much. That's why solar panels, by the way, are usually blue or black, so they can actually absorb more light. The brighter they are, the more light they reflect, the less efficient they become. So if you're not being approached yourself for development, but if you're worried about a project being located next to you, what should you ask? Number one, are you guys that are developing this project going to use anti-reflective coatings on the panels? Okay, anti-reflective coatings will actually significantly reduce the opportunity for there to be glare or other light effects. Is the surface of the module smooth or is it stippled? Lots of times, for the same reason that we have anti-reflective coatings, the panel surface may actually be slightly rough, again, so it absorbs light rather than reflects it. Do the modules incorporate any sort of light trapping technology? Again, any sort of concentrator or other thing that collects light rather than reflecting it? And is there documentation from the manufacturer for the reflectivity? If you hear a term called albedo, that may sound really weird, but what that's talking about is reflection of light, okay? So if you can get data from the manufacturer that says this is how much light these panels absorb, that gives you a good idea of how much reflectivity there might actually be with the panels. And then, of course, what color is the surface in the absence of the modules? If we're talking about, grass is, can actually be fairly reflective. Placing solar panels that are black or matte may actually reduce that. But if you're talking about a white rooftop and you're placing black solar panels on top of it, you might actually be drastically reducing that reflection. I'm kind of sensitive to this issue, by the way. I get people's concerns because I live on the 5th floor of Ag Hall here at Oklahoma State University. They're building a new College of Human Sciences building across the parking lot to the south, and its roof is incredibly efficient at reflecting sunlight back into my office, which, when the temperature outside is 100 degrees, I don't really need to live inside a solar concentrating reactor. Thank you very much. So I understand reflectivity there. Another thing to remember about reflectivity is that you have to think mathematically. You've got to think about astronomy, meaning where's the sun. You've got to think about geometry in terms of what the angle of incidence, the angle of reflectance are, and you might even have to pull out your high school trigonometry book to figure out where is that impact going to be felt, okay? So you really do need to do some math, and the developer should actually be doing a lot of that math for you. When they develop a project, they should be working on figuring out exactly where might any reflectivity effects be felt. But the thing to remember about that, and we have to deal with this in the wind energy industry a lot as well, is that as in wind energy, where we're actually worried about shadows, so too in solar energy, when we're worried about reflections, the sun's always moving, the earth's always moving, and no reflection is going to be permanent. That reflection, wherever it is and wherever it's felt, is going to move over time. And so it's going to be very different during the winter solstice versus the summer solstice versus the fall and spring equinoxes and all dates in between. So even though there may be reflection in an area on a specific day, that probably is only going to occur during a certain part of that day, and the duration of that during the day is going to change over the course of the solar year as well. So all is, again, to say that siting really does matter a lot, okay? And the developer should be doing a little bit of due diligence to show where those impacts are going to be, because they should have some modeling tools to really help them out with that. One thing they can do is to show a map of where the modules are supposed to be located, the surrounding terrain, what potential receptors are, for example, office buildings, homes, etc. in the area. And they should be able to model over a year where is reflection going to be actually noticeable, and for how long will it be noticeable. With that, we have 5 minutes left in our hour and a half. I was worried that we would have plenty of time left at the end, and of course I nerded out and talked way too long. Before we go to the questions, though, real quickly, here's my contact information. My email is shannon.l.ferrell@okstate.edu. Remember, that's a lowercase l, not a 1, not an I. Now, if you do have questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, or personal experiences you want to share, please share those with me, because I would love to learn more about this as we develop that program. I've noticed off to the side our Q&A box has had a few questions pop up. Paul, have you made note of any of those that we can go back and answer right now?
I'm taking over right now, Shannon.
Hey, Ashley.
Ashley. But there hasn't really been a question yet, other than Ted has 2 comments. One was what we have seen with CRP is that the cost of buying out the government's interest generally exceeds a price that is economically feasible. And his other comment was the best leases that I have seen are fixed rate per acre with an annual escalation clause.
Yep, and that would be consistent with the experience that we've seen too. So good observations. Thank you, Ted. Anyone else have any questions? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Nope, that was okay. I was going to say the same thing. If anyone has questions, please feel free to go ahead and comment in the box. And while we wait for questions to pop up, if there are any, I'd just like to remind everyone on the webinar links, if you could click on the evaluation and give us any feedback about tonight's webinar, we do value that. And
Ashley, one more thing. I know some folks have asked about the slides. We'll have those available to you, and I believe also the total recorded webinar will be posted in a few days too. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct, and both of those things will be available.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else have any questions? I'm going to take that as an assumption that I've done an amazing job and answered every conceivable question you could possibly have. But like I said, if I haven't, if that's an erroneous assumption, and I'm willing to bet that it is, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from your questions, and we'll respond to those as quickly as we can.
Yep, absolutely. And thank you, Shannon. And again, the evaluation link is listed on the webinar links, among a few other links that may be helpful and resources from today's webinar. And I guess if there's no other questions, I guess we'll just go ahead and thank our sponsors again. And thank you, Shannon, for sharing your time with us this evening and enlightening us.
All right, everyone, thank you all for coming.
It looks like I might have a comment, so maybe.
Oh.
Just thank you.
All right, well, thank you guys for tuning in tonight. We really appreciate you spending some time this evening with us, and you all have a great evening.
All right, thank you.